This year, 2019, is a significant year for anniversaries, and there are four in particular connected with the story of James Watt that we want to look at. James Watt was one of the most significant characters of the late 18th century. The first of the dates is 250 years last January, when he and his co-conspirator Dr. John Roebuck patented the separate condenser. In August 200 years ago, James Watt himself died, and staying in August 100 years ago, Andrew Carnegie, the well-known philanthropist, died, having previously written a biography of James Watt. Carnegie donated a huge amount of his very substantial fortune to the establishment of libraries throughout the world, and the second oldest Carnegie library in Scotland was opened 130 years ago in Grangemouth, the Grangemouth Victoria Library. So it's apt, given these four anniversaries, that we take a look at some of the local connections with the great man James Watt. And in particular, there are four places of significance. The first of these is at Kinneil, where a workshop was constructed for him to conduct his experiments in 1768. The second is at the Carron Iron Works, where steam engines were fabricated. The third is Carron Churchyard, where his co-conspirator Dr. John Roebuck was buried after his death. And the final one of these is at the Avon Aqueduct across the River Avon, which is on the line of the Bowness Canal, which James Watt surveyed.
Carnegie was asked by the publisher to produce the book. It wasn't his own idea, and at first he refused because he knew very little about the subject. And the reason he was asked, of course, is because it's about two famous Scots people who had such a huge influence on the world. And just as the idea of improving the steam engine ate away at James Watt's mind constantly, even when he was doing other types of work, so the idea of writing the book nagged in the back of Carnegie's mind until eventually he agreed to do it. Part of the reason for doing so was, of course, to reflect his own times, and particularly reflect glory on himself. And it's interesting because there are some nice remarks which have to be between the lines about for his own family. He is very complimentary about his wife. On the other hand, he does say that you have to have been born into poverty in order to become a famous entrepreneur or inventor, just as James Watt had been born into poverty, whereas his own children, of course, were the sons of millionaires and daughters of millionaires, and they didn't have the same thrust in life. The chapter on Kinneil is a little lacking in detail, but it does emphasise the importance of Dr. John Roebuck, who we will come to later on in this story, and the lack of the ability of the local engineers and blacksmiths to create machines to the desired tolerance, which was necessary for the huge improvements that were about to happen to the steam engines. The book was very well received when it was first published, and needless to say, we have a number of copies of this throughout the libraries of the Falkirk district. The small cottage at the side of Kinneil House was constructed in 1768 at the suggestion of James Watt. He realised that the area was nicely secluded, and because you've got the house and the walled garden on one end and the ravine on the other side, it is a nice secretive place in which he can conduct his experiments, hopefully without anyone noticing what was happening. The building's known as James Watt's Cottage, which is a bit of a misnomer because it was built as a workshop so that he could conduct his experiments in secret. And it was built specifically from him, and you can see it contains an awful lot of reused stone. The lintel, for example, has the initials from its earlier use with the limestone on it, and you've got mouldings on some of the stones from the previous buildings in which it was to be found. There are two windows on either side of the main door, so you can have a bench on either side and you can get the light whilst you're working on the finer parts of the machinery. After the experiments, of course, were over, the building continued to be used, and it rather ingloriously was used as the wash house for the main house itself. And the second door was introduced at that time so that you could have a separate boiler in there for the clothes and things like that. The building itself is an important historical artefact, and by examining it you can see the way in which it worked. On the windows, for example, we have these pivots which would have held the wooden shutter, and on the other side there's a bolt hole so that you can lock it from the inside. Within that there's the recess for the wooden frame for the window itself, because even when the shutters are open, you're letting the light in, you don't want to let the cold and the wind in. And as I say, you have to imagine a bench out here with James Watt working with the light of the available day. Today the inside of the building is nice and light, but that's because there's no longer any roof on it. The original roof was pyramid in shape with a pan tile covering. Inside the building, on the south wall over here, there would have been a nice burning fire for the winter months to keep James Watt nice and warm. And in front of the two windows you would have had the benches so that the light would have come in and he would have been able to work by that light. Going out through the main door, he would have gone straight out to the main steam engine, and behind that would have been the stores, so on the back wall of the building. The floor that you can see today only dates to the period after James Watt, when the building was used as a wash house. And the final door was introduced at that time as well, so that they could have the two separate compartments. And had it not already been a World Heritage Site because of the Antonine Wall, the building itself may well have been ordained to be worthy of such a designation. It is probably the only remaining building in Scotland that we can say that James Watt actually used and inhabited, so to speak. Today, as well as having the cottage here on the side, we also have a very large cylinder which came from the schoolyard pit in the town of Bowness itself, and it was moved and re-erected here in 1945. Great thing about it is it was actually one of the original cylinders that James Watt worked on whilst he was here, because as well as conducting his experiments on this brand new model of steam engine, he was also improving the performance of the existing steam engines. Despite the original concept of it being a secretive place, in point of fact, it turned out that it was possible to spy on what was happening. And one of Watt's great rivals, which I call Wattley, was able to see what was happening. He was in Bowness to act as a consultant at one of the local breweries, and managed to pay a visit to Kinneil House, and somehow was able to gain access to the attic of Kinneil House, from which he was able to see what was happening down below. And one of the things, of course, that James Watt was doing at this time was experimenting with loads of different ways of improving the steam engine, not just on this separate condenser. The cylinder came from the schoolyard pit, and it was one of the pre-existing Newcomen style engines which James Watt tried to improve whilst he was in Bowness, because there were already deep mines for the coal here. The Newcomen engine was quite inefficient, and you've got to imagine this cast iron cylinder with its reinforcing bands with a large piston moving up and down through it, and of course the steam forces the piston up. But the idea is also to pull the piston down by condensing the steam, creating a temporary vacuum which creates a negative pressure and pulls the piston down the way. Unfortunately, between cycles, as you condense the steam, it cools the cylinder down. And James Watt realised that about 4/5 of the energy that was pumped into the steam engine was being lost reheating the cylinder between cycles. And he tried different ways of improving that performance and reducing the heat loss, one of which was to jacket this with steam so that it was surrounded by hot air. That actually proved to be the incorrect method. And the correct method is the one that he came up with as he was walking across Glasgow Green in 1765, which was to actually have the condensation happen in a separate compartment called the separate condenser. So that you were actually just cooling that down to a degree, but not to the same extent as the main cylinder. The space here in front of the house, in front of the cottage, must have been a scene of great activity in 1769, when Watt was trying to upscale the successful model that he'd built in Glasgow to full size. And of course, this is a very difficult, quite a costly experience. Dr. John Roebuck was able to get the Carron company to manufacture many of the parts, like the boiler and the cylinder. He brought the workmen in to construct them. And this was a very useful open space because the stream next door to it allowed them to run water along a freshly constructed lathe to a small water wheel. And it sounds incongruous, but the water wheel was necessary for the operation of this advanced steam engine because it allowed them to synchronize the opening and closing of the valves into the cylinder and into the separate condenser. Very important that these should be fully timed, and water power was the most reliable way of doing this. So whilst he was doing his experiments, trying to upscale the model, Watt tried various designs for the separate condenser, and although he did a lot of the work on it himself, they were also hiring tinsmiths at Carron to help with this project, and he also experimented with different forms of piston, one of which, for example, was hollow and allowed the condensate to pass through it. They had trouble with the cylindrical nature of the cylinder because they were not able to produce them truly circular in section, and of course there was damage caused by the workmen whilst they were moving it. So as well as producing them in cast iron, they produced them in thick rolled tin and had to solder the joints, but they never produced a perfect seal. In order to alleviate this problem, Watt and Roebuck looked at different ways of sealing the piston as it was moving up and down the cylinder, including the use of leather and cork and old paper. And Watt became very despondent during the work at Kinneil. It was only to the optimism of Roebuck that he was able to continue the work. And in affidavits much later on, many people such as Roebuck's wife and Professor Small all pointed out that it was Roebuck who was able to keep Watt focused on the work and also came up with solutions to some of the more practical problems. It's quite clear that Watt and Roebuck were good friends, and indeed Watt, whilst he was staying at Kinneil, stayed in Kinneil House itself, not in the cottage, which, as I say, was only a workshop. However, despite their best endeavours, the large machine did not function to expectations, and Watt became very despondent. Eventually, Watt decided that he didn't have the means to complete the work and decided that he needed to earn money to pay for the upkeep of his family. Roebuck was beginning to have financial problems of his own. The fact that they had not completely finished their experimental work at Kinneil and in fact had not been able to perfect the machine, it turned out to be advantageous in the end because the patent was worded in a relatively woolly fashion, and it meant that in later years it was very difficult for other entrepreneurs to work their way around the wording and come up with an alternative solution. That patent, of course, laid the foundation for the wealth of what later became Boulton and Watt. One of the reasons for Roebuck's bankruptcy was his habit of moving from one project to another. He had, for example, established the Carron Iron Works, and he'd been the technical advisor on that, which is why the works had used coke rather than coal. He'd patented a method of producing puddle iron from the cast iron which the works produced, And then he started working on the coal mines over at Kinneil, and he also upscaled the production of salt there. The huge salt pan that he had there was scorned by all and sundry at the time that he constructed it, and yet within 30 years it became the standard in the industry. He also established the pottery industry in Bo'ness, an industry that lasted for almost 2 centuries after his death, and which he handed over to his son in order to avoid its liquidation along with his own debts. When he died, of course, it was realised that he had achieved a huge amount, and his gravestone in Greek lettering tells you that he was the father of the Carron ironworks. And later on, he became recognised as the father of process chemistry in the world. So he also is a very important character. On his bankruptcy, James Watt had to go and earn a living in order to pay for the upkeep of his wife and family, and he was very conscious that that was his moral duty. He took up surveying, which he'd dabbled in before, and became an engineer, particularly on the line of various canal projects and for upgrades on existing canals. He did a lot of work on the Forth and Clyde Canal, and famously he worked on the Caledonian Canal. Locally, he surveyed the line of the Bo'ness Canal, which would have gone from the end of the Forth and Clyde Canal at Grangemouth into the port and harbour at Bo'ness, roughly following the coastline. One of the elements that he surveyed was the crossing of the River Avon, and here he suggested the construction of a timber trough-like structure with piles driven into the soft earth in order to support it. Even the builders of Canal project realised that this would have been a mistake, and they constructed the stone aqueduct, which is now used as the main road bridge from Grangemouth to Bo'ness, and which still survives. The survey work that James Watt did on canals in Scotland helped to pay off a proportion of his debts and, of course, to maintain his family. But at the back of his mind, he always wanted to continue the work on the improvement of the steam engine. And for that, of course, he needed an investor with a large amount of money. Through his contacts at Glasgow University, in particular through Professor Black, he was able to have discussions with Matthew Bolton of the Soho Works down in Birmingham, and it was agreed that he would take over Roebuck's share of the patent for the separate condenser. They slowly moved the experimental steam engine from Kinneil down to Birmingham, where the artisans were able to improve on the cylinder that had been made by Carron. Carron was extremely important to the Scottish economy, and not simply because of the production in mass of cast iron objects, but because of the way it had enabled inventors in this part of the world to get their products onto the market. If we look at example for Small's swing plough, which revolutionised agriculture, it was only thanks to Carron that they were able to manufacture the large number of metal parts for that. They were also involved in the invention of a new type of weapon called the carronade, and in the development of quite sophisticated forms of missiles with Professor Robertson and people like Henry Shrapnel, who of course invented the very famous shrapnel shell. So Carron had many benefits, but as far as Watt was concerned, it was unable to produce to the technical proficiency that he required. The foundry industry in the Falkirk district continued, and within 100 years it became the centre of small castings for the entire world. It was making huge amounts of material and thus reducing the cost. And for 200 years, the iron founding industry in Falkirk became the mainstay of the local economy and produced some fantastic works of art, many of which you can still see. Just look around the streets and you'll see things like telephone kiosks and letterboxes.
James Watt's improvements to the steam engine revolutionised industry throughout the world. They came too late for Roebuck to benefit from, and they were unable to use them to pump the water out of his deep coal pits. But of course, they were then used in later coal mining operations throughout the world, and Bowness was important as a coal mining centre for many years thereafter. The improvements to the steam engine also led to the development of the nebulous railway network, which was able to transport heavy goods throughout the world. And it's because of that that the iron industry in the Falkirk area was able to flourish. At the time that Watt was here, there was only one foundry in the Falkirk district, and that was the Carron Iron Works. Within 50 years, there was almost a dozen, and within 100 years, there were several dozen. They were transporting all sorts of goods throughout the world. We have some wonderful local examples of the material that was being made. For example, over at Larbert Churchyard, there is the Bruce Monument erected in the 1770s to commemorate James Bruce, the Abyssinian traveller who discovered the source of one of the Niles. We also have the Grahamston Gates, which were erected in Edinburgh in 1886 for a special industrial exhibition through there. And if you look throughout the world, you'll see letterboxes and telephone kiosks made by local companies. There are a few buildings in Scotland that we can directly connect with the life of James Watt, and we're exceptionally fortunate in the Falkirk district in that we have the workshop in which he developed the separate condenser. It is such an important building that it really ought to be a World Heritage Site. But of course it already is, because it stands on the line of the Antonine Wall, yet another of the wonderful sites that we have in this area. And even if you look in Bowness Town Centre, we have a number of buildings that would have been there when James Watt visited in order to improve the existing engines at the pit heads. For example, Bowness Library was originally a pub, latterly the West Pier Tavern, and part of it was a tobacco warehouse. So we have all these wonderful monuments and buildings, and we can be proud of the fact that James Watt was here, as were the early pioneers, and they all helped to make Falkirk District the great place that it is today.